program you are about to enjoy is intense. CPU intense. Please ensure all other web browsers, Windows, and media-heavy programs are closed before participating. You may experience audio or video loss if running other programs. Thanks. AEOP membership is pleased to present Person to Person. Tonight, Being Remarkable, an Alumni Sustainability Challenge Special, with your host, Katie Schneider. Tonight's special guests, Dr. Dane Ward, Professor and Conservation Biologist at Drexel University, and Meghan Barrett, PhD candidate in biology and bee specialist. And now, your host, Katie Schneider.
Hi everyone, my name is Katie Schneider and welcome to Person to Person. Tonight we're pleased to be joined by Meghan Barrett and Dr. Dane Ward. Barrett and Dr. Ward are biologists at Drexel University in Philadelphia and served as our exceptionally judges for the AEOP Alumni Association Sustainability Challenge this summer. So in this challenge, competitors were asked to design novel approaches to help address the serious crises facing bee populations worldwide. We're pleased to be joined tonight by Meghan Barrett and Dr. Ward. So you guys, welcome.
Hello.
Hi, Katie. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. We're so pleased you could join us tonight and very excited you'll be speaking to us about bees and the struggles they face. I'm personally really excited to be here. I am a huge gardener and recently I've joined a beekeeping and gardening club in my city, and I've done actually several beekeeping projects during my time as an engineering student as well. So excited to hear what you guys have to say. Without further ado, you guys have the floor and I think we're ready to start the slides.
Great.
Thank you.
So, hi, yes, I'm Meghan Barrett, and this is Dr. Ward as well. We're from Drexel University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we are excited to be sharing with you today some problems that are facing pollinator populations. So I wanted to start by introducing who we are, and I'll go first. So like I said, my name is Meghan Barrett. I'm a PhD candidate in biology at Drexel and a native bee researcher. So my job really right now is to go around the world. I've been to Cuba and Australia, and I've worked in the Sonoran Desert of the United States as well to study different pollinator populations. One thing I'm really interested in is thermal biology, which is basically how organisms respond to thermal pressures in their environment, whether that's solar radiation or input from the sun, or you might think of things like air temperature. I'm really fascinated by how especially desert bees, like you can see in the picture in the bottom right corner, respond to increasing environmental temperature. So that's me, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Ward.
Yeah. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Meghan had said, and Katie with her wonderful introduction, I'm Dr. Dane Ward. Unlike Meghan, I would actually title myself a conservation biologist. I study a wide range of organisms, some of which you can see here, and I haven't included a bee picture here because obviously you'll see plenty of those in the coming slides. But my primary focus is to utilize population ecology in order to conserve rare and threatened species, of which bees fall into my portfolio, and that's what brings Meghan and I together in a couple of our collaborative research projects, primarily in Cuba and in Philadelphia. Also, I am a hobbyist beekeeper, which may or may not have been one of the things that got me into the conservation biology of bees.
So Dane and I wanted to share with you a little bit about how we actually first met in terms of a research perspective and the kinds of fun and exciting research work that we do. And Dane, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your work in Cuba and then how we got together on that project.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. This is actually a really fun story for me. So Megan and I had been friends. We were both working in the same department and building at Drexel University. And I had known Megan was an exceptional bee biologist. For me, I had been doing work in Cuba for quite some time educationally, talking about conservation and habitat ecosystem processes. But I have a friend who you can see pictured in this middle picture on the far left, Profe Jose Andres, who approached me when he found out that I keep bees back home in Philadelphia. And he approached me and said, hey, I've got this problem. We've got a bee population that we see declining, and we need to know how to better manage it. It's very important to us for pollination services. It's also very important to us for medicinal purposes. Can you help? Which is one of the things we love to hear in science, to work very collaboratively and in support of folks in their kind of backyards. So having known Megan already, I approached Megan and I said, hey, can we partner my conservation biology expertise with your bee expertise? And could we involve some students in some science in Cienfuegos, Cuba? A few months later, Megan and I wrote a successful grant, and were able to bring along 4 freshman students to join our Cuban colleagues and Cuban students to conduct research on a very rare species of bee native to Latin America.
Yeah, and that species of bee is called Melipona beechii, and you'll actually probably see it later in our presentation as well. But it's a very unique and actually endangered species of bee that is, like Dane was saying, native to Latin America. And what was really cool about this project was that we got to integrate multiple different kinds of bee research all in one place. So we were doing community surveys on the kinds of native bee populations that exist in Cuba. You can see some people sweep netting in a couple of these photos. That's looking for bees of different types and different species. We also did some thermal biology work. You can't bring me along without doing a little bit of thermal biology, looking at basically what kinds of temperatures can these endangered bees survive, right? So that's what we call thermal tolerance assays. And then we also did some work on how bees learn. So, you know, when bees are given the option to pick one color versus another color, and you've trained them to the first color, how often do they do it? How reliably? What colors do they actually gravitate towards naturally? We did a lot of learning on bee cognition as well. So it was a really exciting project to get to partner with our collaborators in Cuba. I was very appreciative of Dane bringing me along, and we've been working together on various kinds of bee questions really ever since. So what we'd like to talk about now is what pollinators are, because I think we come to these conversations often thinking that we know what a pollinator is already, and that may or may not actually be the case. So I'm thinking most of us, when we think pollinators, we think honeybee, right? Or this graphic right in the middle here, you can see some honeycomb with a bunch of honeybees on top of it. But everybody else on this slide is also a pollinator. And in fact, there are even more that aren't listed on this slide. So we can see, of course, that we have honeybees, but we also have native bee populations like that beautiful rainbow-colored euglossa in the top left. We have ants and we have flies, and wasps and butterflies and moths are all going to be insect pollinators, along with beetles and a couple of other insects that aren't even listed on this slide. Then we have some birds and bats that are going to be considered pollinators as well. Some are very specialized to particular kinds of flowers. We have rodents and monkeys and lemurs. We have geckos and other lizards and reptiles. And in fact, there's even some cases of mollusks engaging in pollination, including slugs. And lastly, we have people who engage in pollination. So you can see in that picture underneath the honeycomb, a little paintbrush, and that's somebody who's actually gathering some pollen from the anthers of that plant, and they're going to deposit it on another plant somewhere else. So these are all acts of pollination that can occur. And when we think about these are biotic organisms, right, that are engaging in pollination, but there's also factors like wind that can engage in pollination too. So plants have a wide variety of options available to them when it comes to kind of attracting and maintaining their pollination services. But there are some general problems that all those biotic pollinators are going to face. And we want to start by talking about those. So 3 really big ones are going to be habitat loss, invasive species, and climate change. So habitat loss can look like the total destruction of what you see in that picture on the right, but sometimes it can be more subtle or it can look more attractive to us. Like, for example, a lot of organisms lose their habitat when we build cities in that area or when we build a house on top of where they used to live. So when habitats are lost, it means there are less nesting sites and places for organisms to build or find homes, but there's also lower floral diversity or lower floral abundance, and both of these actually matter. Just like we require diverse diets, so too do other organisms. And so they require a bunch of different kinds of pollen and nectar to be able to thrive. So when we actually destroy that habitat or we lose habitat, we usually are talking about losing multiple kinds of flowers, and that means that the diversity of their diet is reduced. It's sort of like if you're only able to find apples or you're only able to find corn, you're going to be missing out on protein and other kinds of nutrient-rich sources because you're limited to one food type. The other thing is going to be lower abundance. So when you clear land, obviously you're getting rid of the plants that were in that place, and that's going to reduce the amount of flowers available so it can support fewer organisms per unit area. And so that means that organisms are going to have to work harder to find food and find floral resources. And the last thing is when we think about habitat loss, sometimes it doesn't just matter how much habitat is lost, but where that habitat is lost. So one thing we like to talk about is habitat fragmentation. And that's where habitats kind of split off from each other. So you might have two habitats that are both really good for pollinators with, say, a suburb or a road right through the middle. And if they can't cross that boundary, whatever it is, basically maybe the distance is too great or the obstacles in the way are too great, it means that it's harder for organisms to find mates that might have more genetic diversity from other populations that they used to have access to, along with the fact that, again, it reduces their foraging area for resources. So there's a lot of issues associated with habitat loss for pollinators. Something else to talk about is invasive species. So invasive species can cause increased competition with the species that were already in the area. They can also be introduced new predators that the organisms are not evolved to recognize or know how to deal with. And lastly, it can cause, again, the loss of habitat or the usual resources or nesting space. And one thing I want to talk about in relation to that, invasive species and habitat loss, is also what can happen to migratory organisms who need stopover points in various areas on their migratory path. And they might actually use the same stopover points year after year, which is something that we see happening with migratory populations of, say, monarch butterflies or even some birds and bats that migrate. So when they're invasive species, one way that people try to manage them is to actually get rid of certain areas that are frequently used by that new invasive species. Sometimes those are stopover points for those migratory species, and then they have nowhere along their migratory path to rest, and that can cause some really serious problems too. And the last thing we want to talk about is climate change. So in that bottom right corner, you can see a time series graphic from NASA that I just took a little still frame of, and that's from 1884 to 2016. And the things in red, orange, and yellow are going to be increases in temperature from 1884 to 2016. The things in blue are going to be decreases in temperature. So obviously, when we look at that graphic, we can see that overall, the graphic is more red to orange to yellow than it is blue. So overall, there are more increases in temperature than decreases. But also, it's important to look at where those increases and decreases are happening. So pretty much all of those decreases in temperature are happening in places where pollinators don't live and plants don't live. So in the middle of the ocean or in Antarctica, which is not known for its great floral diversity and pollinator populations. So what that means is that there's a lot of increasing temperature happening in areas where organisms inhabit. This is going to present thermal challenges to organisms. I know we've all probably been too hot on a summer's day, but usually we're able to go inside, get some shade, have some water, seek some relief, and that's not always true for these organisms, especially ones that, you can imagine if running makes you hot, imagine flying when you're the size of a bee. So that's going to really increase your body temperature, and you might not actually be able to make it someplace safe to rest in the shade. So other than those thermal challenges, one thing that climate change does is actually disrupt the evolutionary relationships between plants and their pollinators, either geographically or what we call temporally, which means time-wise. So when we think about that, flowering plants appear at a certain time in the spring. I'm sure we've all seen plants that weren't flowering start to flower, and that happens at around a consistent time every year. And the same thing happens with pollinators. First they weren't there, and then they appear. And those are because of environmental cues that they appear at roughly around the same time, usually within 2 weeks of each other every single year. But as the environmental cues start to change due to climate change, the flowering plants might appear too soon or too late for their pollinators. And what that means is the plants don't get pollinated, which is obviously really bad for the plants. And the pollinators, when they're around, don't have any resources to eat, which means they're either not going to survive themselves or they're not going to be able to produce many offspring that they're able to feed. So that's what we call temporal shifts between the flowering time of the plants and the pollinators appearing that need those plants. But we also have geographic changes due to climate change. So we know there's range shifts that occur for different species. For example, they might move away from the equator towards the poles to seek cooler temperatures on average, or they might move elevationally up a mountain, for example, an increase in altitude. And what we find is that more mobile organisms, for example, bees and bats and birds, move faster than the plants move, right? Because we know that plant populations are a little bit less mobile than things that can fly. And so what that means is you get this geographic discontinuity where the plants are still in or nearby that original range, but the pollinators have moved to a new range. And unless those pollinators are able to adapt to the kinds of floral resources available in that new range, they're not going to be successful there. Just like the plants, if they can't find new pollinators to replace the old ones in their old range, they're not going to be successful either. So these are some really pressing concerns that climate change presents us when we talk about how it disrupts the evolutionary relationships between plants and pollinators. So those are all problems that face all pollinators, which I know is dramatic, but we also have pollinator-specific problems to worry about. So I have just two examples here because, as you can imagine, if there are a lot of pollinators, there are a lot of pollinator-specific problems, way too many to talk about today. But first, what we have on the left is going to be an example of monoculture. So monoculture is a kind of agriculture that is very high efficiency, and it's where you plant one kind of crop over and over and over again in an area. I'm sure we've all passed a really big field of corn or soybean or something like that. So what this actually can make for certain species of bee is a food desert where there's suddenly no longer available to them any of the food resources that they need to survive. So the bee underneath that picture is what we call a squash bee, and it is a specialist pollinator that can only utilize the pollen of squash plants. So what that means is when they live near or around a monoculture crop field, like for example, this field of corn, all of a sudden there are no resources available within flight distance for this particular pollinator, and it's going to perish because there's no resources available for it to survive. So that's one example of a pollinator-specific problem. Another one would be wind turbines and how they affect bats and bird populations, especially those that migrate. So a lot of us think of wind turbines as a really wonderful source of renewable green energy, and that is 100% absolutely the case. But we still have to be careful where we choose to put them and how we design them to make sure they're not causing adverse impacts on our wildlife. So one problem is that birds and bats are not used to wind turbines existing in the environment, which means that they don't know to avoid them. And oftentimes they'll fly right into them and they'll get hit by the blades as they swing around, and that can cause injury or death to those individuals that hit the wind turbine. One problem when wind turbines were first made is that they were placed in the migratory paths of some birds unintentionally. And what that means is that as those birds migrate in mass, there's a large die-off of individuals when they hit those wind turbines. So what are some things that we need to do when we consider wind turbine design? Well, of course, there's echolocation devices to warn bats away from something they can't see. There's also ways to make them less attractive to birds so that birds can see them a little bit better. But of course, also one really great thing to do is just to avoid the migratory paths of bats and birds for where we place our wind turbines, which of course means we need to study those populations well enough to know which paths they take. So those are some examples of pollinator-specific problems. So if we have all these problems, the kind of logical conclusion is that we need solutions. And that's why we're so excited to be here talking with all of you and seeing all of your really creative solutions to the problems that pollinators are facing. Because we need solutions on every scale, on a global scale, a national scale, a local scale, and the scale of specific species even. So global scale, we're talking about things like solutions to climate change, reducing invasive species transport from one place to another, perhaps through even things like economic or trade policies, or customs practices, and then also better data on biodiversity in poorly studied areas. When we talk about poorly studied areas, we're talking about places like the tropics typically, where we just haven't robustly surveyed the kinds of organisms that exist there. And one great way to actually build up biodiversity studies in the tropics is to partner with local collaborators, like, for example, Jose Andres in Cuba, which Dr. Ward has done. So better overall data on the pollinator community health, both globally and across multiple years, again, that's temporally, is really going to help us understand how and why and where biodiversity is shifting. If you don't have the data to know what's going on, you can't really best target your efforts to the areas that need the most help. When we talk about national scale, I'm going to focus specifically on the US for this particular presentation. We're talking about things like making sure that habitat is protected for species that are rare or declining, like, for example, the Franklin's bumblebee has a very narrow habitat, and that's a habitat that should be protected. We're talking about endangered species protection and making sure that organisms like invertebrates can be listed as endangered species. Oftentimes, the data we have on biodiversity for invertebrates like bees and wasps and ants is so poor that we actually aren't able to get them listed as endangered because we don't know enough about them. So when you look at endangered species lists, they're often dominated by birds, bats, mammals, lizards, reptiles, etc., even though invertebrates are also very threatened. We're talking about things too, like diversifying our energy sources, making sure we're relying less on fossil fuels and fracking and things like that. Corporate regulations on pesticide use for agriculture and even residential. And then, of course, removing or managing invasive species. Then we talk about the local scale. And those are things that all of us can do in our towns, in our backyards. And we'll talk more about this later, so I'm going to run through it pretty fast. But these are things like no-mow lawns, habitat for pollinators, reducing our own fuel consumption, awareness campaigns, educating your neighbor, educating your friend, diversifying your gardens, reducing pollinator food deserts, and removing, again, invasive species from your area. And lastly, that species-specific scale we already talked about with the examples with the squash bees and the wind turbines. So there's a lot of places where we can all work together to try and solve those pressing problems. Okay, so that was a lot about pollinators broadly. But now I want to focus in on what I think most of us are probably most interested in this presentation, which is bees. Certainly, I come to every presentation most interested in bees. So sort of like what we just did, where we said, what is a pollinator? And we realized that maybe we didn't know as much as we thought we did about pollinators. A similar sort of thing can be done when we talk about bees, because when we think about what is a bee, most of us probably think, again, of a honeybee. And that might not necessarily be true either. So when we look at this slide, we've got an example of a bunch of insects, some of which may surprise you. You might not have seen them before or recognized what they were. So all of the ones in red boxes are going to be bees that you can find in North America somewhere. So some of them you're going to recognize, like in the bottom row, the third one in from the left is a honeybee, and we're probably all pretty familiar with that. And the fourth one in on the top row is a bumblebee. There are about 50, 55 species of bumblebee in North America. So that's something else that you've probably seen at least one of sometime. But some of them maybe you haven't seen, or if you did see them, you didn't recognize them as a bee. One of those would be the bright green bee in the bottom left corner. That's an agapostemon. It is very, very common all across the United States, but it is a solitary bee. But I'm guaranteeing you, if you live in the United States, you can probably find that bee pretty close to your backyard. The same thing could be said for some of these bees that are agriculturally important. For example, the only one in the second row all the way to the right is the blue orchard bee, and it is actually a really important agricultural pollinator, it turns out. So some of these bees may not look like bees to you. They're not yellow and black. They've got really weird looking morphologies, which basically means their body form. But that's because bees are super, super diverse. There are over 4,000 species of bee in the United States. The honeybee is only one of those species. There are 20,000 species of known bee in the world, and there are 30,000 estimated to exist, which means there's 10,000 out there, mostly in the tropics, just waiting to be discovered. So there's a lot of work clearly to do still to study bees and to understand even the bare minimum of what the species are that exist. So, okay, we've just basically, I think, probably revolutionized everybody's understanding of what a bee is. So that means we need to go all the way back and say, like, really, what makes a bee a bee? If it's not just the honeybee, what unifies them? In essence, bees are vegetarian wasps. And what that means is that wasps are meat eaters, if you will. So they're going to collect insects and spiders for their young and use those as protein sources. Well, bees still need protein sources, but maybe they didn't like competing so much with the wasps for those insects and spiders. And so they diversified into a new niche, or ecological niche, or niche, depending on how you like to say it. And they're going to use a new protein source, which is going to be pollen from plants. So this is true for almost all bees, and it's why they're so fuzzy, right? They need all that fuzz to be able to collect the pollen, whereas wasps are not fuzzy because they're not trying to collect any pollen. Now, with every rule in biology, there are always going to be exceptions. And the exceptions for bees to the vegetarian rule are vulture bees and cuckoo bees. So vulture bees actually are going to be eating kind of like rotting meat sources. They use that to make basically their version of honey, if you will. And cuckoo bees don't really collect pollen themselves. Instead, like cuckoo birds, they take over the nests of other bees and use those nests for laying their own young. So most bees, when we consider bee diversity, are going to be solitary. That means that they have no queen and no colony. That's very unique to mostly honeybees and bumblebees. Also, most of them live in the ground or in twigs. So there's no hive, there's no honeycomb, and most of them don't make honey at all. In fact, they might make bread or soup instead. Many of them are going to be stingless or very unlikely to sting. In fact, some of them have stingers that are so small that they're not even able to sting you because their stinger is constantly stuck inside their own abdomen. And many of them are specially adapted to pollinate particular plants. One great example is the bee in the bottom right corner of this slide, which you can see has some very long front legs. So that bee is actually specially adapted to pollinate a plant that has really its pollen stuck very deep inside of it. And so it can only reach deep inside with legs that long. So a honeybee wouldn't be successful at pollinating that plant. So when we think about most bees, they're not really like the honeybee. So now I want to talk a little bit about if the honeybee is really the bee, because I'm guessing most of us are like, why haven't we heard about these other 3,999 species of bees in America? Well, the honeybee is widely and broadly considered to be the bee because it's the easiest narrative, the easiest story, and because it's very agriculturally relevant. So we will still talk about it later, but I want to give us some perspective on why the honeybee isn't necessarily the most important focus. So first, let's talk about honey production, which is something that the honeybee is really well known for. It turns out there's actually more than one type of honeybee. So the honeybee you're probably thinking of with that beautiful wax honeycomb is what we call the European honeybee, or Apis mellifera. And it is actually not native to the Americas. It was introduced by European settlers when they came over to the Americas, probably for agricultural purposes. But there are species of honeybee that are native to the Americas, and they're typically found in the tropics. So one example of that is what Dane and I were talking about earlier in Cuba, Melipona beechii. So Melipona beechii, actually, interestingly, is introduced to the island of Cuba, but is going to be native to places like Mexico, where it was kept by the Mayans all the way from when they were at their height to this current day. And it's kept for its absolutely delicious honey. You can see some of its brood cells and its kind of unique spiral cake topper stacked structure in that top right picture. They make really delicious honey, just slightly lower quantities of it than Apis mellifera, but with the benefit of not stinging, which is really nice for people who keep it. There's also wasps that make honey. You can see that paper wasp nest in the bottom right corner is the Mexican honey wasp, or Brachiogastra. You can see all of those filled with a very dark, delicious looking honey. And there's even ants that actually fill themselves so much with nectar that their bodies expand to make them look like little honey pots. And they're basically storage facilities for other ants in their colony. They keep all that excess nectar so other ants can feed from them when there's times of low resources. And that kind of condensed nectar that they house in their abdomens is basically a form of honey and can be eaten and is eaten by people to this day. So they're not the only honey producers, and they're not necessarily the best at pollination either. When we think about different kinds of pollinators, there's two general categories we often break them down into: generalists or specialists. So generalists are going to be bees or pollinators that rely on basically any kind of pollen they come across they're happy to use as long as they can access it. Whereas specialists are going to be bees that really can only rely or try to only rely on a couple of types of plants, like those squash bees I told you about earlier, or that bee with the really long legs. So oftentimes there are plants that have really specific morphologies or shapes that only specific pollinators can access. And so since honeybees don't have those adaptations to those plants, they cannot pollinate them. And so really the specialists for those plants are going to be the best pollinators for those plants. The other thing would be that floral specificity often increases pollination rate. So when we think about from the plant's perspective, what pollination is, it's transferring pollen from plant A of the species to plant B of the species. But when we think about what honeybees do, often they go from plant A of the apple species to plant B of the tomato species to plant C of the watermelon species, and so on and so forth. And that tomato pollen doesn't help the watermelon plant at all, right? That honeybee needs to visit yet another version of the tomato plant in order to be able to successfully pollinate. So specialists, right, they're constantly visiting the same type of plant. And so that floral specificity can increase pollination success for plants. The other thing is how honeybees actually carry their pollen. So when you look at that honeybee in the top right picture, you can see it's got a pollen basket stuck on its hind leg, and that's called a corbicula. Now, the pollen basket is great for bees. It basically means that they pack all that pollen in there and they don't lose very much of it, and they're very efficient at gathering it. But again, when we think about it from the plant's perspective, they need some of that pollen to fall off the bee if at the second plant, if any pollination is actually going to occur. So when it comes to the loose packing, like you see in the bee in the bottom right corner, where it's just sort of hanging all over the bee, that doesn't seem very efficient for the bee, but that's great for the plants because it means the next time this bee visits a plant, a bunch of that pollen is going to fall off and is actually going to pollinate that next plant. And the last thing is there's many different ways that plants prefer to be pollinated. And one example of that is going to be buzz pollination. So some types of plants, for example, tomatoes, require buzz pollination. And what that means is the plant basically holds all of its pollen in a little pollen purse. And it only opens the pollen purse so that the bees can get to it if the bee vibrates near the plant at a very specific frequency. Bumblebees are amazing at this, but honeybees haven't figured it out. So if a honeybee approaches this kind of a plant, they're actually not able to pollinate it at all. They don't know what to do with it, and the pollen won't come out. So what that meant was before we had bumblebees adapted for agriculture, people actually had to go around from plant to plant and hit a little tuning fork next to it to collect the pollen from it, and then collect that pollen and use a paintbrush to paint it on the plant next door. So we had to hand pollinate all of those buzz pollinated plants. Now that we have bumblebees that are able to do that for us, it increases the efficiency. So honeybees aren't necessarily the best for their pollination ability, and sadly, they also can be a real threat to native bees. So like we said, in the Americas, honeybees are not native, and so there's about 3,999 native species, and then the one introduced honeybee. And honeybees, like we said, they're really successful because when they move into an area, the whole colony moves in, and so they're going to take a ton of resources for that colony all at once. And what that means is that they're going to disrupt the ecosystem that was already there, and the ability of all those solitary pollinators, each one doing all their own work every single time, they're disrupting their ability to collect resources successfully. So there's a lot of research that's happened in the Americas that basically shows that honeybees compete with native bee populations for nectar, for pollen, and conserving them doesn't really help our wildlife in any way, along with the fact that honeybees can disrupt plant pollinator networks by outcompeting very important native pollinators. When they disappear, all of a sudden you're losing specialists, and you're basically losing the ability of those plants to be able to be pollinated successfully because the honeybee is so much less successful at it. So the honeybee, unfortunately, has some drawbacks to it. So when we think about who's the bee we should really be rooting for and really be thinking about in the Americas specifically, we're talking about the native bees. And that's a more complicated story just because the native bees, of course, there's so much variation to them that we can't paint one easy picture about how to save them or what to do. But that's okay, because now that we know that diversity is what we're going for, we should work our best to provide diverse solutions to all those different kinds of diverse native bees. And the other thing is that native bees are really good at kind of filling in where honeybees fall short. So there's been some studies that show that as honeybee pollination decreases due to climate change, native bees are actually able to buffer that negative impact on the pollination of, in this case, specifically watermelon. So we've seen that native bees are able to kind of provide us with some insurance, sort of as a background pollination force against honeybee losses that have been ongoing in the States. We just need to figure out better ways to manage those populations successfully for agriculture. So, okay, we've talked a lot about native bees. Let's really quickly reiterate some of the threats that face native bee populations specifically. And then after that, we can talk about some solutions and the way that we can all be part of the solution for native bee issues. So habitat loss, like we talked about before, leads to the loss of nesting space, floral diversity, and floral availability. That can be both through monoculture and things like agricultural intensification, also urban transformation like we talked about before, and even actually our own lawns, which you can imagine, given that there's not a lot of flowers dotted throughout that lawn that you can see in that top right picture. Those are going to be, again, food deserts for bees in the area that are passing by looking for a meal. We have things like competition with introduced pollinators and invasive species, like, for example, the honeybees outcompeting native bees for floral resources. Also, honeybees have been shown to transmit viruses to some native bee populations. So that's another way that they can negatively impact wild populations of bees. Then we have agricultural intensification in the context of pesticide use, which I'm sure many of you focused on for your project, and so you know a little bit about. But pesticide usage indiscriminately by residents or through agriculture can lead to toxicity and bioaccumulation for native bee populations, which can be dangerous. Again, all those things we talked about with climate change, flowering cycles, and species range changes. Bee development is actually dependent on temperature. So if the larvae get too hot, that can be really dangerous for their development. And then again, the same things associated with overheating and losing water as you're traveling through very hot environments. So what are some solutions? Well, the first thing is going to be really thoughtful agricultural management that actually considers the species in your area, right? So if you have 400 species of bee in the state of New York, how do you think about what kinds of agricultural practices will best support both the crop outcomes you want and also the pollinator populations that are nearby? So one thing about this would be reducing your pesticide spray. Another thing that's been shown to be very successful in super agricultural areas is the planting of hedgerows, which are basically big rows of pollinator-friendly plants and living spaces along the edges of monoculture crop planting. So that can provide space for pollinators to live and a lot more diversity in floral resources. Another thing would be considering local biodiversity by using GMO crops instead of pesticides or herbicides. So those would basically be crops that are designed with genes that only target very specific groups of insects. So if you have monarch butterflies nearby and you know that's an endangered species and you don't want to be hurting that species, and you have a pest beetle population on your crop, well, it turns out that beetles and butterflies have very different digestive systems and they can be targeted with GMOs. So you can actually build into your plant the ability to only kill off beetles and not kill off butterflies at all. And so that can be a really important management step. We also, like I talked about earlier, need biodiversity surveys and experts. These are very hard to identify to species in some cases because there's several thousand of them. The characters that you might look at to figure out how they're different from each other can be very, very hard to learn. So we need more of those experts to know where species live, what plants they're using, how they live, all of that sort of stuff, which means we need more bee biologists. So all of you out there, I'm looking at you. Also, we need more citizen scientists, and this is a great way that you can help. So there are often local BioBlitz events that happen when it's safe to be in large groups. This would be hosted by your museum or your local university, and they would have you go out and collect insects and then bring them back to experts that have volunteered their time to help identify what's in the area. So you can participate in those. You can also use the iNaturalist app, which you can find on your phone. You basically take pictures of organisms in your environment, you upload them on this app, and then experts can identify the plants that they're visiting. They can realize that they're in the area. It can help scientists find range expansions, which has happened for bees that I study. We've gotten reports of new ranges from the iNaturalist app. So we know that they're moving northward and westward in some cases. So it can really help scientists track more data from more species than we'd be able to alone. And something else would be education and awareness, right? So tell your friends, your family, your teachers about how many hundreds of bees are in their backyards and the multitude of challenges they face. Because while the bees have a lot of great corporate and agricultural, the honeybees have a lot of great corporate and agricultural marketing and awareness campaigns, the native bees unfortunately don't. And so it's up to all of us to make sure that we're really doing our part to educate and bring awareness to other people about the challenges that these bees face. One great way to do that for yourself that's really fun is this book, The Bees in Your Backyard, which is actually the book that got me interested in bees. It's not terribly expensive. You can find it on Amazon. It's full of beautiful colors, color photographs of all the different kinds of bees you can find and where they live, and it's specific to the United States. And I should say continental United States, but there are probably other bee books for your area and field guides for bees for your area if you're not located in the continental United States. Okay, so solutions. Other things that you can do, provide living spaces for bees nearby you. So bees nest in twigs, they can nest in dirt, they can nest in bee hotels, which you might have seen before, they can nest in the dirt of your lawn. So thinking about ways that you can conserve those areas as good houses for bees is one way that you can help. Leave those small twigs and that clutter in the fall for overwintering bees like Seratina, which are small carpenter bees that like to nest in little tiny twigs. And so when you clear those out, there's nowhere for them to live. You can also use less pesticides on your lawn and mow it less frequently, which allows bees to actually live there, along with some solitary, very beneficial wasp species. You can leave some empty dirt paths in particular areas of your yard, which can both help bees that need mud for nesting collect that dirt to use it, and it can allow them to nest in the ground in that area as well. Bee hotels are something you may have heard of. You can see an example of that in the bottom left of the 3 pictures we have. The jury's out on bee hotels. Even though they're very popular and obviously very beautiful, bee hotels attract a lot of parasites that target bees. And so if you're not into cleaning your bee hotel every single year and kind of renovating it and updating it to make sure you're clearing out those pest populations, it's going to turn into basically a parasite hotel. And they'll take advantage of any bees that are put into that or make their home in that hotel. They'll basically take over and use them for parasite reproduction, which is not beneficial, obviously. So if you're going to do a bee hotel, more power to you, but please make sure that you look up the appropriate procedures for how to clean it and make sure that it's parasite-free for bees every year. And lastly is going to be providing resources. So that's changing how we conceptualize what a beautiful lawn means, and also changing our urban areas to be a little bit more green or perhaps even multicolored when we think about floral diversity. So like I said before, lawns and urban areas are food deserts. We want to plant plants in those areas. Like you can see in that bottom right corner, they've planted a pollinator strip right in the middle of their lawn that but you can also plant it at lawn edges if your lawn is small enough. You want to plant native plants. So again, we don't want to be promoting a lot of invasive species. There's a great website resource for this, xerces.com. Xerces is a pollinator protection society. And you can see what's native to your area, or you can look at your local university web pages and make sure that you're trying to find things that flower at different times of the year. So a couple of things that flower early in spring, midsummer, and then later in the fall, to make sure there's resources available for bees in your area all year round. And with that, that's everything I have on wild pollinators. So I'd love to stop here and get some questions, and then we can hear more from Dr. Ward about the amazing things that honeybees can do and the threats that they face.
Yeah, thank you so much, Megan. That was awesome. I have to say, I think there is kind of an idea that bees and wasps are pests. You know, they sting you, they buzz around you all the time, they're really annoying. And so I just want to say I appreciate that we're getting a different perspective, and they are very critical to our world and our survival. Also, I just Googled while you were talking, bee covered in pollen, and it's like the cutest thing I've ever seen. So I highly recommend doing that. And it just, I mean, they look like little puppies or something. I don't know. They're adorable.
They do, right?
Yeah. So no, just thank you guys. This is very informative and really helpful, I think, to change that mentality. So yeah, a few questions. One, Megan, you talked about researching thermal tolerance of bees and things like that. Have you ever worked in really cold environments and how bees can survive, whether that be a backyard hive or just naturally in really cold environments?
That's a great question. So I work in the deserts primarily, so I'm looking at really hot environments. Yeah. But there is some stuff known about adaptation to cooler environments. I'll tell you one really cool story about bumblebees, which bumblebees are really interesting because you'll often find them foraging much later in the year when it's much cooler and all the other bees have kind of gone away. And so a lot of scientists have said, how are bumblebees out foraging? You know, is it just that they're so fluffy and so they're insulated? How are they out foraging when it's so cold out? So one thing that bumblebees have adapted to do to be able to forage later in the season than other bees is actually they've learned how to shiver. So they detach internally, they detach the muscles that control their wings from their wings, and they shiver them really, really, really fast to build up a bunch of heat. So their body's hot enough that they can reattach those muscles and start to fly. And that's something they can do on the fly, if you will, while they're out foraging to maintain a high enough body temperature to be able to forage later in the year.
Wow, that is really cool. I had no idea. Okay, so there was a very large interest in the AEOP Alumni Association Sustainability Challenge. There's a really big interest in bats. So I was wondering if you could just point out a few differences. I mean, obviously bats and bees are very different, but just a few differences in the way they pollinate, for example.
Oh, bats. You know, I'm really an invertebrate biologist.
No, that's fair.
But I think, let's see. So often the bats that pollinate, if I'm not mistaken, I'm going to say that this is not an area where I'm very much an expert. And Dane, if you feel more expert, feel free to cut in now and stop me from saying incorrect information. A lot of them are pollinating fruit bats. So they're going to be bats that are kind of like looking for fruit and engage in pollination while they do so, whereas bees don't care about fruit really at all. That's not something that they're going to be into. I also believe that most bats that pollinate end up being more specialized than some of the very generalist bees that we see, like honeybees.
Yeah, I would add just one more thing there, Megan, and that is that flower morphology is going to be really important here. Mm. And so bats being larger bodied, obviously, than most of these bees, are approaching flowers that are a little bit more open. And in many cases, they're embedding their entire face into that flower, where you could imagine that a bee would still do the same thing. Bats are going to be far more effective at doing that. And your bees are going to also assume the role of visiting flowers that are more morphologically similar to their body shape and size.
And I did want to say one other thing that I should have mentioned about bats is that often they're pollinating at night. So they're pollinating flowers that open at night, whereas most, not all, but most bee species are daytime. And so you're going to see either really early morning or mid-morning foraging from most bee species.
That makes sense. Yeah, that is very interesting. Okay, we'll ask one more quick question. Could you give like a distance of a typical migration for a bee, like how far they can realistically travel in a migration season?
That is a great question, and it is very dependent on the different types of bees. So what I would recommend that people do is look up the smallest and the largest bee that you can find in the Americas. So the smallest is going to be Perdita minima, or if you just look up Perdita, you'll find the smallest group of bees, and they're all relatively similarly tiny. If you look up the biggest bee, that's going to be Xylocopa. So that's going to be your carpenter bees, which probably most people are a little more familiar with than Perdita. Perdita is a southwestern United States desert specialist bee, and so people are not as familiar with that as they are with Xylocopa. So when you look at something the size of a Perdita, it's, I think, 0.08 inches or millimeters. It's got to be inches, 0.08 inches long. Very, very, very small, right? And so what that means is it really can't fly very far per unit of time. So when we think about Perdita, we're saying maybe a maximum of a football field per year, right? Is how far you're going to see a group of them travel. When you're talking about Xylocopa, Xylocopa can fly much, much, much further. So I don't have specific numbers for you there because I'd have to look up the actual paper that correlates body size with foraging distance by Jim Kane in 1987, if you are fascinated by this. And really but that particular paper does correlate it. It would show you that they can forage definitely several miles per foraging trip.
Gotcha. Well, that is very cool. Yeah, I'm excited to look more of that information up. So yeah, Dr. Ward, if you want to start talking about your backyard experiment, I'd love to hear more.
For sure. So as we saw with Meghan's great introduction and background on all bee biology, essentially, a couple of things that stood out about native bees was the importance of mitigating backyards and this idea of food deserts. And so I've got this, I'm a scientist, of course, I'm a conservation biologist, but I've got this weird little experiment that I set up in my backyard because of happenstance. So I never really wanted to be a beekeeper. I'm sorry to admit that to everybody who was so excited about honeybees, but I stumbled across them actually living in a house. And somebody says, oh, well, you're a biologist, can you help me? And I was like, okay. So I would say relocated these bees from my house into a hive, and that's what started me on this journey of beekeeping. Now, as many of the folks who had submitted wonderful proposals for our consideration are aware, honeybees are not an easy, let's say, pet or thing to manage. There's a lot that comes with that. And so I had my trials and tribulations, but in trying to maintain these in a sustainable fashion, these honeybees, I started to look at my yard and really try to understand what was going on here. In some years, my honeybees would do great. In other years, the honeybees would really suffer. And I didn't see any really dramatic changes in things like varroa mite or some of the other pests that we're very familiar with. And so I started to think about maybe not just my backyard, but my neighborhood and the landscape surrounding. And I live in a very suburban area. What I come to realize is, from a lot of literature search and also personal observation, is that these anthropogenic or human modified environments are very noisy and random. And so really this year's been great for bees, and I kind of attribute that to a lot of folks who have gone back to gardening. Katie, as you and I were chatting before the talk, you were saying you're really into gardening, also into some bee work. And when we see that folks return to gardening, that's providing more resources not only for European honeybees, which was my first concern, but also for native bees as well. As I continued on, not only was I worried about the success of honeybees, and you can see from the pictures here on the far left, that's a single deep Langstroth hive for those who are familiar. And you can just see the bees are just spilling out of this. There are easily within this hive, that hive, if I recall, was 2 Langstroth hive bodies deep. So we're talking somewhere about 80,000 individual bees living in that colony. The frames, right, the brood frames that we're looking at are just full in the second image here, where every one of those kind of light yellowed kind of capped cells is a developing larvae. We then look at the third picture here, and we're just looking at the honey that I took. And I didn't take much honey from the hives in my backyard, but just what you're looking at in those boxes in that third image is about 12 gallons worth of honey. And so, yes, in my backyard this year, I've got a lot of honeybees. I've got also a lot of honey, but last year I had none. Right? And last year I had 4 colonies. 2 of them died in December. The other 2 made it through, but really weren't terribly successful. I started to think about the stochasticity or the randomness of suburban landscapes. Basically, what is my neighbor doing in their yard? What am I doing in my yard? The whole collective. And I started to modify my space. You remember that Meghan said that lawns are these food deserts. They provide no resource for much wildlife at all. I get a random rabbit every now and then, and it's only there to eat the clover, which also the bees like. And so I set out to advance here, set out to modify my backyard. And so being the kind of nerdy scientist that I am, I made a map of my backyard and I quantified how much of my backyard was occupied by lawn, how much it was occupied by shrubbery, and then flowering plants. I also went off and in my journal that I have for this little weird backyard project, I wrote down which ones were native plants and which ones were ornamental, non-native plants. And it turns out I only had one native plant in my yard, and it was a singular sunflower that I had planted because somebody had gifted it to me. What I decided to do in that moment was overhaul my yard. And you can imagine that's really overwhelming. And a lot of folks probably don't want to do that because they like the aesthetic of a clean, crisp grass, either front or backyard. And so I committed to myself that I would modify 10% of my yard each year until my yard was a manageable but natural-esque landscape. In doing that, I cut up some grass. I just cut it out and kind of tossed it away in the compost. And then with that exposed dirt, I left some of it exposed dirt, but then I started to put in some of the plants you see here. On the first image where you see this beautiful tiger swallowtail, that's a milkweed, a very common milkweed that we have here in the eastern United States, which is loved by all pollinators almost uniformly. You can see that I still have some relatively non-native plants. This is a marigold with a skipper on it, so a butterfly that's also come to my yard for these floral resources. And then you see the two images to the right, the classic sunflower image, and then also a coneflower, which is a great perennial native plant for us here on the East Coast. In doing this, I thought, hey, I'm going to provide a little bit of buffer capacity for my honeybees. I'm going to help those guys out. And if I'm lucky, I'll find some new pollinators as well. What I did in this past year, because it's been kind of a pandemic-induced quarantine, I spent a lot of time observing. And I found in my yard that the honeybees don't visit these flowers all that often. Right? You look at these images and not a single one of them is of a honeybee on one of these plants. Instead, I've got a wide diversity of lepidoptera, butterflies, moths. I have the bumblebees visiting. I also even have these other smaller bees here, like two little mouse nesting in this sunflower. And then I have a bunch of other pictures. I couldn't put them on the slide of even other bees that I haven't even identified yet. Sorry, Meghan, I'm going to have to hit you up for that one. But not a single one is of a honeybee. Still, remember that this year I have a massive amount of honey. My honeybees did great, but I also brought other bees to the yard. I do occasionally see honeybees visiting these plants, don't get me wrong, but the vast majority has been these native pollinators. And the reason for that is I've kind of ameliorated some of the circumstance associated with a food desert, even if it's in my small little backyard. You'll remember, though, that with Meghan's talk about native bees, that overwhelmingly everybody's thinking about bees as European honeybees. And so we're in a bit of a quagmire here, right? We've got European honeybees, and many of the folks who submitted these wonderful proposals documented or cited this study by the FDA that says, yeah, about 1/3 of our North American crops are in fact pollinated by the European honeybee. And there's a lot with that. There's a lot of kind of socioeconomic and political reasons why we have old world crops that we grow here that we're familiar with. It's because of the majority of populations having brought some of them with them or cultivating them even further. And also the fact that the European honeybee is a generalist species, as Meghan had said. What happens even further to kind of perpetuate this challenging situation we're in is that honeybees produce honey. And I've yet to find a single person who, when you offer them honey or say, do you like honey, says no. I'm still looking for one, but everyone at least appreciates that honey tastes good and is sweet. And as humans, we tend to like those things in our diet as well. And so what happened was that long ago, folks had managed honeybees, European honeybees. They started to create boxes. They started to create frames that these honeybees like to build on. And they became very industrialized in the kind of management of this bee species. One, out of necessity, because we need these bees for pollination of 1/3 of our crops. And secondly, because they produce honey. And so what we have here is a singular species providing two economic inputs into our local agricultural economies, right? They pollinate and we can eat, and then they give us honey on top of it at the end of the summer. And that's a win-win for anybody who's doing or engaging in an agricultural economy. The quagmire, though, is that with this European honeybee and its kind of now ubiquitous nature, right? We can find it everywhere, across the world even. Even our colleagues in Cuba, they've got native bees. Then they've got this naturalized Melipona beechii, which produces honey. They even also keep European honeybees. And the reason, you'll ask them, well, you guys have Melipona honey, why would you keep European honeybees? And they go, well, we keep Meliponines for really delicious honey, but they produce less of it. And then we keep European honeybees for our everyday honey, right? Because they produce so much of it. And so what they're doing is they're engaging in this kind of bet hedging scenario. So if you keep more things, these farmers think, okay, well, I'm going to have different types of honey, different economies, and also greater diversity. Now, the challenge is we don't know quite yet in Cuba, for instance, how European honeybees, Meliponine bees, and native bees all interact in resource distribution. But from the literature, it seems like it might be a very challenging situation as well. As we keep these bees for our 1/3 of the crops that we need to pollinate, we also engage in some, what I would say, ecologically risky behavior. As an ecologist and a conservation biologist, the first thing I'll tell you is don't ever take one thing from spot A and take it to spot B, right? Whatever it is, whether it's seeds your granny gave you to plant in your garden, or whether it's soil on the bottom of your shoe. And the reason for that is that you're carrying things that you don't know you're carrying. Even if you could crack open an entire beehive and check every bee for varroa mites, you will miss them. And so what we have is an economy where we've got some crops that only, or not only, but are now only pollinated by European honeybees because local natives have been kind of at least temporarily eradicated. And so we're moving these hives around. You may have heard this interesting statistic that something like 80% of all European honeybee hives are shipped to California for the almond blossoms, to produce almond honey and to pollinate all the almond trees. That means that almost 80%, some people estimate 90%, almost all of the bees that are kept by professional beekeepers go to the same geographic vicinity, intermingle, sometimes drift from one hive to another. Foragers sometimes don't go back to the right hive, and they exchange parasites. They also will breed there, right? So virgin queens will leave a hive and they'll go to mate, and they'll mate with male drones from who knows where in the continental US otherwise. And so there's a lot of transmission of pests and parasites. That continues even locally. In my own backyard, yes, I still have varroa mites, I still have hive beetles, and I know those are being picked up from either feral hives that exist in the landscape that no one's harvesting honey from, or from other kind of backyard beekeepers like myself. Given that kind of scenario, that transmission poses a lot of threat to this one species. We're not entirely sure what those threats look like for native species, but there might even be transmission or transference of viruses, pests, etc., between these massive amounts of honeybees and local natives. But remember, as Meghan said, those local natives are understudied. And so we don't know if they're also picking up varroa mites or some of these other deleterious viruses. Anyhow, we're stuck in this weird relationship. We're stuck that we need honeybees, European honeybees. We need them for at least 1/3 of the crops that we generally consume, but we also need them because we now have a cultural history with them, right? Keeping honeybees is a pastime for many families. It's also a relaxing hobby, despite the fact that you sometimes get stung. For me, I enjoy it. It's one of my interactions with nature that I can partake in on a weekly schedule without having to leave my backyard. But they do face threats, right? And so there's, in this risky scenario, about 1/3 of our agricultural output is at risk of collapse if we lost these European honeybees tomorrow. The ones that we'll talk about, right? And many of the applicants mentioned at least one of these in their proposals, but varroa mites are the big one. I put them at number 1, and this is Dane's short list of things. We've got colony collapse disorder, and I actually will, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to ignore colony collapse disorder tonight. And the reason I'm going to do that is because most of the time when we have a colony kind of just randomly collapse, we can't, as scientists and or hobbyists, determine whether it was because of varroa mites, hive beetles, virus, poor nutrition, or actual colony collapse disorder. And so it's a very troublesome thing to talk about. In fact, it's probably more than one of those factors at any one time. Another one that I'll talk about is hive beetles. This time of year, hive beetles are finding their way into these European European honeybee hives in order to either take honey and pollen from the bees, because it's already collected and centralized in this one location, but they're also using it as thermal refuge. So you heard Meghan's a thermal biologist. Well, when winter comes, a lot of things want to stay warm, and European honeybees, with those tens of thousands of bees in one very tight proximity, actually generate a really remarkable amount of heat. They maintain an internal hive temperature of about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The way they do that is just by huddling together and shivering again, or shaking. And that temperature must be maintained throughout the dead of winter, regardless of where the hive exists, in order to promote larval development. But hive beetles are sneaking their way in there. They're eating all the resources, and they're also laying their babies within the hive. And so they can explode very, very quickly in a hive, to the point where they actually are going to taunt the honeybees into basically not wanting to reside there anymore. And next thing I'll talk about briefly is pesticides, because I do see that as a really big problem in local and agricultural beekeeping. And as we mentioned before in the native bee scenario, some things hold over for these European honeybees as well. Reduce floral diversity and reduce habitat availability, whether that is through habitat fragmentation, habitat replacement and loss, or whether it's in a nutritive sense, right? If you don't have a great diversity of foods to eat, these honeybees aren't going to be very healthy, and likely, I think, will perish probably over the winter. And finally, climate change. Climate change has really thrown a wrench, and maybe I should have put that one in bold and given it a slide, but climate change is making beekeeping really, really difficult. Two things that happen with climate change right off the bat. Your winters, at least in North America, are far more unpredictable. They actually stay warmer longer, or we oscillate between cold spells and warm spells, cold spells and warm spells. And you'd think, oh, well, that's really great for these bees because they don't have to shiver as much to stay warm. It's much the contrary, though. These bees, when it hits 60 degrees Fahrenheit, will actually leave the hive and go outside as if they could forage. But it's the dead of winter and there's nothing out there. And so they actually exert a lot of energy going out. In many cases, if sun sets too quickly, they could get trapped outside, and foragers or hive members could get lost. And that's a huge decrease to their population. But if they come back hungry, because they were just out exercising on a day they probably shouldn't have been exercising. So they come back and they eat more honey. They eat more pollen out of the hive, and they'll actually starve the hive out because of these oscillations in temperature throughout the winter. Another one that Meghan had talked about relative to climate change is the flower periodicity, which we call phenology. In a lot of cases, spring comes earlier and fall comes later, which extends the season, the active season for honeybees, but the flowers haven't yet extended that season yet either. And so the bees are active, but they're not necessarily taking in food. And so a honeybee keeper like myself has to supplement their diet, which can be costly, but also very much non-natural. Anyhow, I'll talk about just the three that I had in bold. So varroa mite. A lot of folks are interested in varroa mite, and it is a very, very important parasite of European honeybees. It thrives off the fact that honeybees exist in their colonies at very high densities. And so these varroa mites can go unnoticed very, very easily. It's like sneaking into a movie theater in a crowd of people. No one's going to notice any one particular character. And so the varroa mite hitches a ride in, it sheds off of the female workers and will find its way into a comb cell where it will then lay eggs on or in the cell while a developing bee is maturing. And you can see that in the bottom image here. That is a larval bee. It obviously hasn't made it to maturity and emerged from its cell. Instead, a worker probably came by and uncapped the cell and removed it prematurely. That's actually a good thing. That means that the nurse bees in the hive can acknowledge that this is a compromised larvae. And what they'll do is, bees are very hygienic for the most part. They don't go to the bathroom in the cell or in the hive or in cells, and they clean everything after it's been used for its initial use. And so when they find varroa mites or other pests, they'll actually drag it out of the hive. In many cases, they'll maybe dispatch of that parasite by biting it, and then dragging its corpse out of the hive and basically throwing it out. Or they'll take the larvae out and they'll sacrifice the larvae in order to reduce the pest load. That's something we call hygienic behavior. You can see that in the bottom here. And folks have really started to explore this more with genetic breeding programs. I say ectoparasite at the top just to make that clear. That is a parasite that lives on the outside of the organism, not inside the organism. And it tends to reduce larvae from developing to adulthood. So hives that are heavily impacted by varroa mites might go from 80,000 bees in the hive down to 20 or 30,000 bees. You might think that's a lot, but remember, if they can cram 80,000 in there and they need to do that for their thermobiology, more than half of those missing really compromises the function of the hive. Though there's 80,000 bees, they really act as one, and they all act to support a singular queen, which is evolutionarily phenomenal, but also not really great if you're trying to hedge your bets, right? You've got everything invested in this one individual's success. So some of the ways that we can deal with varroa mite, right? Yeah, it could be hygienic breeding. It could also be making sure that you have got a lot of local adaptation in your bees, so that your bees are, when you develop new queens, you develop them in situ or in your backyard, essentially, so that you don't go to a breeder of honeybees and buy a bee that has genetics from Indianapolis and bring it back to Philadelphia. That bee is going to be adapted more so to that climate in Indianapolis than it would be in Philadelphia. So you want local diversity and you want a lot of diversity. So having a lot of bees around so that a female can mate with multiple males is preferred in most cases, which is cool. They don't mate with just a single male. They go out for these flights and they might mate with several dozen males, which all leads to a more diverse offspring genetically. You could also treat them with chemicals. And some of these chemicals are more naturally occurring than others. Formic acid is a good one. Formic acid is produced by ants, and ants will often use this to dissuade their predators from consuming them. And we found that it turns out formic acid also interrupts or interferes with varroa mites' behavior, much like a few folks had mentioned with essential oils, but we don't quite know if the essential oils are nearly as effective as formic acid. What happens with each of these chemicals, because chemicals are so, again, temperature dependent, you can only apply them at certain times of the year, and you have to apply them in a very judicious manner. If you apply too many, you will kill all of your bees flat out. And in fact, applying any one of these chemicals, whether essential oils, formic acid, or oxalic acid, will kill some amount of adult bees. And so you'll sometimes see like a little pile of dead bees in the front of your hive while you're treating them. And those are the ones that just simply couldn't handle the vapors coming off of these treatments. They die, and that decreases your hive population as well. And so you're kind of rolling the dice. Am I going to take care of the varroa problem, or am I going to kill too many of my own workers? So it's a mixed bag what we see here, right? We've got to monitor often. We have to know what we're dealing with when it comes to varroa mite. And we do have to treat with varroa mite, because if we don't, that will also crash our colonies. So we've got to be very careful about it. And we certainly do need new methods for how to deal with varroa mite in the beekeeping practice and in feral hives as well. It's unlikely to go anywhere, right? So we've got to adapt and mitigate the negative effects of this mite. The next one that I want to talk about is actually the small hive beetle. And I want to talk about it because it's often confused with varroa mite. They both look like small, roundish, dark brown or black organisms. But if you look at this closely, you can see that this is a beetle because it's got that really kind of hard exoskeleton. And if you look down the middle of it, on the bottom half, you can kind of see a line that goes down the middle, which separates its elytra, which are those hard outer wing coverings. You don't often see these things fly because they're in your hive, so they're just crawling around, but they get to your hive via flight. When they get in there, though, like I said, these are a kleptoparasite, meaning that they're going to steal resources from your honeybees. They start eating honey, they start eating the pollen, and they're small enough they can hide in every little nook and cranny. And when they do, beetles, almost every beetle is a very fecund or reproductive individual. They lay hundreds, if not thousands, of eggs over their lifespan. And so when the eggs hatch, they turn into these little maggot-like larvae. And the damage isn't from the adult beetle, really. The damage is from their offspring, because they lay these eggs and they'll lay them in cells that could have honey in them. And then the eggs hatch into these little larvae, and immediately they all hatch at the same time and they explode out of the cell. And that's kind of what you're looking at here. And they start eating into other cells of honey. And so if you have hive beetles and you're going to try and take honey from it, you're actually going to be taking honey you should not be consuming, because you've got these larvae, perhaps some of their remains are in there, some of their waste is in there, and the honey actually becomes putrid. So not only can you not use it, but your honeybees can't use it. And so hive beetles are a really dangerous kleptoparasite of our European honeybee. There are some really easy ways to deal with them, though. Again, monitor their populations. They always spike this time of year in the early fall in North America because temperatures drop and they want to be warmer, so they find their way into the hive. They also can be trapped. So there's a couple ways that we could put like little fuzzy balls of like dryer lint or steel wool in the corner of the hive, and the bees won't go near that stuff. But the hive beetles don't know any better, and they're always looking for the dark little crevices. They go into there and they get stuck. You can see that their legs are a little bit got like these little spikes on their legs, and so that gets them caught on it, and they can't get away. They can't eat, and they'll actually starve to death and die. The easiest one, though, is location. You see two pictures here. The middle picture with these green hives, you can see that there's a shadow cast on them by trees. So these hives have been positioned in a shady, vegetated area. That's pretty atypical. And the only folks who tend to do this are backyard beekeepers. They put the hives wherever they can. But when you see a professional beekeeper in the image below, you always see the hives almost in straight lines or rows, but they're always in a very open, sunny field. And there's always the vegetation around the hives is really reduced, or it's kind of rocky or paved. And the reason for that is these beetles will hide out in vegetation, and then they only fly for a few feet at a time. And they'll fly up to the hive or crawl up into the hive in vegetated, shady areas. They hate the sunlight. And so one way that you can actually keep these things from infesting your hive is to put your hive in a sunny area. That also helps your bees with their thermal biology, which is kind of cool. Let's see. Last thing here is pesticides. And I talk about this because of what Meghan had presented earlier, right? That maybe we don't all know what bees are, and we all think that bees are the European honeybee. Even worse, we often think that bees uniformly are wasps, right? And so wasps are always ornery. You guys have probably seen this image in the upper right all over social media over the past year or two, where it's like this one's the friendly one, this one's like the stinging jerk, and this one's just like the murder devil or something like that. And they even call it, well, that was the European hornet, but now you hear about the sensationalization of murder hornets. I really want to talk to whoever is in charge of PR for that species. But they get a really bad rap, and it scares people. And then you hear an insect flying around your head, and you see it going into a really small hole, and it's got to be a murder hornet. At least this summer. The number of times I got a call about how people have murder hornets in their backyard, and mind you, we're in Philadelphia. Murder hornets have only really been found in the Pacific Northwest so far, and only 2 occurrences. But murder hornets are everywhere. My phone won't stop ringing about them. It's not a murder hornet, guys. In a lot of cases, it's a fly or it's a bee. Worst case scenario, it's a yellow jacket, which is a wasp and can be a little feisty. But as soon as a bug buzzes by someone's ear, their instinct seems to be, let's go grab the raid. And okay, so this isn't happening in farm fields, right? Farmers aren't grabbing bottles of Raid. Instead, they're using something a little bit more broad spectrum where they're kind of just spraying it across the field. But in suburban landscapes where I'm telling you that beekeeping is probably a pretty safe practice, folks are grabbing Raid. People are also planting things like neonicotinoids or plants with neonicotinoid chemicals that are designed to reduce insect predation of that plant. But we know neonicotinoids actually cause neurotoxicity in all insects. That's how it kills them. They can't behave as they should, and they'll starve to death and die. The same thing happens to honeybees who visit those cute little flowers you just bought from Home Depot or Lowe's and put in your garden bed. So it alters the behavior, it reduces their survival. And a big problem with all of this is that there's a lack of specificity. I don't have anything against the company, which I think is Johnson & Johnson or something, that makes Raid, right? It's not about Raid. It's about chemicals that are designed to kill pests. The problem is that the cheapest way to make those chemicals is to make them kind of broad application. Just kill everything to be safe. And that really poses a lot of threats, not only to our honeybees, but to our native bees disproportionately. And also, if you're doing this in an agricultural setting, the application doesn't tend to stay there. In a lot of cases, they're kind of dry applied or mist applied. So when it rains, the chemical will wash off of the plant actually and could run off of the landscape into local waterways. And if it's dry applied, it can literally blow away for miles. And it could blow to a forest landscape where there are no pests. And it could still affect native bees and European honeybees that are existing far from these monoculture agricultural settings. So what to do, right? Yeah, we do have some pest insects, but we do want to protect our native and in some cases European honeybees. We should follow the principle of precaution, right? Err on the side of caution. Spend the 15 minutes it takes to maybe Google search the thing you saw and see, is it a murder hornet? No, it's not. Or is it a local native, either European honeybee or an actual native bee? Or reach out to someone who is an authority and say, hey, I think I just saw a murder hornet. And we could very quickly say, no, you didn't. Please don't put the can down, step away from the can. It's probably somebody who's not doing as much harm as you might suspect. And then this is where some of the things like GMO technology or other organismal control, things like using parasitoid wasps or fungi to control very specific pests come into play. The reason those things aren't used as often, they're very expensive to develop, whereas the chemical is not. The chemical is already developed, it's already in circulation, and so it's the easiest thing for us to do to deal with our troubles. But there are alternatives out there, and I'm sure we'll develop more of them as time progresses. With that, I'll just invite questions. Definitely, I'll take some of the questions that may have come in, either Katie from you or from other folks. And if anybody ever wants to chat conservation biology of insects, they can feel free to reach out to Meghan and I.
Sure. So just a few quick questions. I think you mentioned you can supplement beehive nutrition. So for example, if it's a poor year for flowers or whatever, I think they can eat the honey in their hives, but how can you do that? How can you supplement nutrition?
Yeah, I love this topic so much because for beekeepers, it has turned to not necessarily waiting to see if we need to supplement, but just going for it and supplementing always. The way we can do this is we've got European honeybees can take sugar water. And so we can just take cane sugar, mix it with water, and we can feed them that. But you imagine that's not nutrition, right? That's just carbohydrate. That gets them jazzed up, lets them go for a little while, but it doesn't sustain them. And so what we do is we actually collect pollen from other plants. We'll mix that with, in some cases, essential oils. One that we use a lot of is thyme oil, which contains thymol, or lemongrass oil, which bees seem to overwhelmingly love. It actually stimulates one of their pheromones, so they're always attracted to it. But those things also provide nutritive benefit. And when we mix pollen from a bunch of different sources together, then they can selectively take from that and have a more robust diet. That's
really cool about the essential oils. I had no idea, but that's very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, and then one more. So I've read articles about beekeeping in cities, and I'm talking like New York City on rooftops and stuff. How effective is that, and is that actually sustainable?
Yeah, and I kind of danced a little bit here, right? I told you about the quagmire we have, but I didn't tell you whether to keep honeybees or not.
Right.
What I will tell you, and this is just Dane's feeling about this, right? So observing native pollinators a bit, but also observing honeybees. The safest places to keep honeybees as a hobbyist are suburban and urban landscapes. So a lot of folks, even in Philadelphia, will keep honeybee hives on top of apartment complexes. And you might think, well, it's a city. There's nothing for them to forage on. And that's not true. There's actually, at least in Philadelphia, we've got a great inner city greenscaping. We've got one of the biggest inner city park complexes in the world. It's called Fairmount Park. And so there's a lot of flowers that are kind of natively occurring, or maybe not native, but there are resources out there for honeybees. And in a lot of cases, because the city already exists, it's already eliminated a lot of the natives from the landscape. And so honeybees aren't going to compete so much with the natives there, hopefully, right? So we're reducing competition because we already have a reduced diversity in native species. So it does work. And I think it's the safest place to probably keep honeybees as a hobbyist.
And to add on to that really briefly, one thing about urban areas is that there's often a lot of ornamental introduced plant species in those areas that aren't really available to native pollinators anyway. So oftentimes honeybees can be actually kind of okay in that sense that they're able to pollinate those introduced plants and take advantage of those introduced plants without pushing out native pollinators. The other cool thing is that honeybees are great for helping you map where available plant resources are in a city. Because you can follow where they're going using their little waggle dances, you can actually see where those pollinator populations are finding flowers in different times of the year. So that can help you actually figure out, okay, we actually have this large pool of resources in, this northwest quadrant of the city. We need to be, making sure that we're monitoring there for native bee populations too. So it can really help you get an understanding of what your city actually looks like from the perspective of a bee.
Yeah, well, this is great. It seems like there are a lot of ways people can get involved, whether it just be researching or even no matter where they are, if they want to start their own, endeavor into beekeeping. That's pretty neat. So, well, I think that's all about the time we have tonight. But thank you so much, Meghan and Dr. Dane Ward, for joining us. And thank you to our audience, too, for watching. Just a few more things before we go. Although we have pre-recorded this webinar, you guys are more than welcome to still send questions. So emailing them to AEOP or the emails you see on the screen. And once we've gathered your questions, we'll send out responses for everyone to see. So we're excited to hear what you have. Any question goes, whether about beekeeping or just pollinators in general, anything like that, we're happy to hear from you. And then also don't forget, on October 13th, our regular person-to-person will be preempted, so we may bring you a special broadcast of our third annual AEOP Alumni Association Awards. So tune in then to learn about the 7 remarkable winners of this year's Alumni Association Awards and the winners of our Sustainability Challenge to Save the Bees. It's going to be a really great night, so we hope to see you there. Until then, thank you for joining us, and everyone, please stay safe. Good night.
Thank you all.
Miss an exciting episode of Person to Person? Can't make our live broadcasts? Why not subscribe to the AEOP membership YouTube channel and never miss an episode again? For more information on the Army Educational Outreach Program opportunities in your area, simply visit www.usaeop.com. Thank you for tuning in to AEOP's Person to Person. Join us again in 2 weeks.